We come now to a discussion of what I like to call the tools of the trade of biblical scholars, known as biblical exegesis. The word exegesis comes from a Greek word which means to lead out of or the reading out of the meaning of a text, the critical analysis and interpretation of a text. You can say that the goal of biblical exegesis is to reach an informed understanding of the biblical text. The amount of effort necessary for the interpretation of a text varies greatly. Some texts, which are written in common day-to-day language, do not require much effort and are readily understood, as in the case of some of your text messages if you're using acronyms like LOL. Other texts, such as laws, are written in highly specialized technical language. Lawyers and judges spend much of their time exegeting laws and law codes and studying the history of their application. In many respects, biblical studies endeavors to build a bridge between today's world and a world that existed 2,000 years ago. Now, whether we build a strong bridge or a rickety one depends on how we approach biblical exegesis. A method which is employed in the analysis of the texts is referred to as a criticism. Criticism here should be understood to mean analysis, not an expression of disapproval or finding fault. The techniques for this type of analysis are ever evolving. New approaches continue to be developed. But for now, I'm going to identify a few of the traditional methods of biblical criticism. We read different material with different expectations. When we read an ad, for example, we know that the author is trying to sell us something, and so we approach the facts claimed with a certain caution. The social setting of a text, known as the Sitz und Leben, acknowledges that certain forms serve certain functions. Form criticism identifies these forms and how they diverge from the norm. Even when certain type or genre of writing, scholars study literary forms or components within them. So within the Gospels we have prophetic sayings, passion narratives, parables, miracle stories, and historical narratives. One of the limits of this method is that it can't tell us about the historicity of the material. Source criticism seeks to identify the underlying sources of a text. It asks such questions as, does the text have any underlying source or sources? Which version of a source was used in case there is more than one? What do the sources actually say and mean in their original contexts? And how are the sources used? Were they quoted? Were they paraphrased? Were they adapted? Redaction criticism looks at the author's theological purposes in shaping a text. Redaction criticism was developed in the 20th century. It recognizes that the gospel writers took their sources and shaped them into their final product. In looking at what the evangelist did with the material, we can ascertain the theological emphasis the evangelist was trying to make. Narrative criticism is an approach which considers the texts as stories, viewed in the way that can shed light on the author's main interest on some passages, but if taken to extremes can create more problems than it solves. In his introduction to the New Testament, Ray Brown Rhetorical criticism takes a look at how the author used their choice of words, how the material was arranged in order to make the material effective. Social criticism studies the text as the reflection of and response to the social setting at the time. What insights from sociology can help in the interpretation of the text, and what patterns of human social behavior are evident in it. Textual criticism focuses on the texts that are available to us. We currently have some 5,000 fragments of the New Testament, and examines the differences between these texts. The Gospels were originally written in Greek, but we do not have any of the original copies. The copies were handwritten from the first copy up to the invention of the printing press. Many times these copies don't agree among themselves, but mostly in minor matters. There are several reasons for the variance that we find. The first two are variants which are attributed to scribal error and scribal editing or correcting. Mistakes could arise as the result of misreading, mishearing, or even, as Raymond Brown suggests, a misreading. While some corrections were to omit something that might not seem correct to the scribe, the deliberate changes included modernizing spellings, supplementing with explanatory phrases, and variants could also be produced as the result of copies in different. Historical criticism has a history all of its own. It's controversial because of the perception that it sets itself against theology, and it has evolved over the course of time and provides valuable insights into the text. Its primary focus is to determine what it was the author of the book tried to convey. Scholars refer to this as the literal sense, meaning what the biblical authors intended and conveyed to their audiences by what they wrote. To even start at this type of an understanding, we need to understand the world of those first followers of Jesus. So we've taken about a 10,000-foot overview of a little better than a dozen different ways to approach the New Testament. The question now is, how do you possibly cope with all of them? Well, there's a saying that goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you only have that one tool in your toolbox, you're going to be severely limited to what you can build with it. Similarly, if you only use one tool of exegesis, you will be severely limited in what meaning you might be able to draw out of the text. This is not to say that focus on a single technique would not bring some valuable insights. But as Raymond Brown writes, different approaches to the text must be combined so that no criticism becomes the exclusive manner of interpretation. Interpreters who employ the various forms of criticism in a complementary way will arrive at a much fuller meaning of the biblical text.